Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Space. I'm your host, Daniel Fox. Our guest today is Dr. Kate Rubin. Dr. Rubin is a former NASA astronaut, scientist, professor of Computational and Systems Biology, and founder-director of the Trivedi Institute for Space and Global Biomedicine. She was the first person to sequence DNA in space. Selected as NASA astronaut in 2009, she has led the development of spaceflight hardware and techniques for studying molecular and cellular biology in microgravity and contributed to the design and testing of NASA's next-generation lunar spacesuits. She has completed 2 long-duration missions, 4 spacewalks, and spent 300 days aboard the International Space Station. Her current work bridges space exploration and global health with a focus on genomics, synthetic biology, and biomedical innovations. Dr. Rubin, welcome to the Future Space.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Appreciate you having me on the podcast.
Before we get into our conversation, Dr. Rubin, what would be 3 words that for you capture the essence of space?
I think the 3 words that I would use are infinite, unifying, and revelatory. I think infinite's pretty self-explanatory. You know, this frontier is pretty much boundless. That was particularly driven home for me on spacewalks, where you sort of look out into the blackness of the universe and realize just, how much is out there. I say unifying because, as humans on Earth for millennia, we've all looked up at the stars. And although they don't look the same, you can see the stars and constellations from anywhere on Earth. It also, I think, points to the international cooperation that we have on the International Space Station. So, there's a number of countries that are participating in the International Space Station, and there are politics, right? We have astronauts and cosmonauts from Russia working side by side. But at the end of the day, you're up there together. You're facing extreme danger together. If the space station is on fire, my Russian colleague is going to pull me out of that fire, and I trust them completely. And so I think when humans are together fighting danger, sometimes what's happening on Earth becomes a little bit less important.
Having not a common enemy, but a common cause.
Yeah, although space can be the common enemy, it's usually trying to kill you. And then the last one is revelatory, and that's because I think it can be revelatory at the personal level. I mean, you can see this incredibly beautiful planet, and you have a sense that we are just all on this planet together, and there is nothing else that your eye can see that would seem to be able to support life. And you realize kind of how unique of a situation that we're in. I think it's also revelatory from a scientific perspective, because every experiment that we've ever done on Earth has always had gravity, kind of this force field just pushing down on everything. So when you go to space and you take away that effect of gravity, we all of a sudden see new properties of cells, physiology, tissues, human physiology. Just our entire biological response completely changes in ways that we haven't been able to see before, and we just can't simulate on Earth.
I mean, on that note, do we have a place in space? Our evolution on Earth has constantly readapted itself, and the general argument could be that the fundamentals of it haven't changed. It was simpler adaptation. As we go to space, it's very different. So can we see a future beyond the planet?
I think so. I am a little bit cautious in terms of talking about settling Mars or setting up space-based colonies, just knowing how hard it is to keep humans alive in space. The International Space Station requires 7,000 pounds of cargo about every 3 months to be shipped up there. And that's to keep 6 or 7 people alive. So the logistics of that challenge is immense. I think at the same time, humans always want to explore. Like, we're going to the bottom of the sea. In our history, we've explored every continent on Earth. And so I think there's a drive to figure out how to have humans stay in space longer. I think the problem with that is evolution does work on a very slow timescale over many, many generations. And so we're going to have to figure out how to evolve our own, we call them countermeasures at NASA, ways to counteract the deleterious effects of space. We're going to have to do our own evolution, right? That's going to come from outside sources, mechanical things like lower body negative pressure, pharmaceuticals that we're taking for radioprotective effects. We're going to have to rely on external sources to be able to cope with the rigors and the dangers of space.
My personal opinion about nature and space is the scale of the universe is so that somewhere the odds of nature will work to a point where one species has the capacity to go beyond where they started. It would be such a waste of any investment to have all this life developing in complexity and entropy only to disappear when the sun will disappear for whatever accident. So now, for the first time ever, and supported by technology, I think the success of our species has been to take that foundation of nature, but also created a certain stability and consistency in where we can build on top of it. And helped with technology, now we have the capacity to take that nature story and take it beyond and continue the mission of life if you want to go a little bit bigger. But is that your understanding of life and our capacity to take it beyond?
Yeah, I do think so. I like this idea of the mission of life. I always tend to think in terms of scientific discovery. And so, as we're sort of continuing this exploration, right, that we've just found so many incredible things about the human body in the 25 years of the International Space Station, we're just scratching the surface. So what are we going to learn about humans as we go to the moon? What are we going to learn about our solar system? The moon is this like great Rosetta Stone of the solar system. When we go to Mars, what are we going to learn about there? So I do think it won't be a swift process unless we have some incredible technological breakthroughs in propulsion, but we will do it. I absolutely have faith that humanity will continue to push forward. I think we have to be careful about what we do, right? We can't go litter the moon. We have to do this in a better and more careful way. For example, like low Earth orbit, we really trashed that with a lot of satellite components and leftover rocket bits. And there are rules now about disposing of your satellite. And NASA's taken an approach that, we are not going to litter the moon. Things have to be brought back. They're going to be done in a sustainable way. But I think we're just going to continue to explore. So I'm excited about the scientific discoveries that are out there that are yet to come.
What do you think microgravity can bring us in terms of scientific discovery? Just before we got onto the call, I shared with you the new plot in the TV show Scarpetta with Nicole Kidman, in where she's a medical examiner. And then suddenly now you have this twist, this murder that's happening around synthetic organs that are being manufactured in low orbit. Is that a reality that now we can talk about?
It's not a reality yet. The regulatory process for that is pretty intense. The idea that the FDA is going to be able to approve a bioprinted organ in space to be transplanted to a human being, we're quite a ways away from that. But we are able to do things like grow organoids in space. And so those are little collections of cells that resemble, for example, a liver or a kidney. And we can see a lot of changes. So, for example, kidney cells vascularize much better in space, which is a problem when trying to grow organs on Earth, that the blood vessels don't reach into the center of your material and then the tissue dies, it becomes necrotic. So we've studied a few different organ systems in space. There's a great project from NASA called Tissue Chips that's involved in setting up these organoid systems. And so we're starting to learn about a lot more. And what we're seeing really, space microgravity is changing everything from the cellular level to, as you start building up the tissues, because you don't have gravity pushing down, you can build up these really delicate tissue structures. Everything is suspended. The tissues interact with each other in a different way. Cell-cell communication, structure, function, all of those sorts of things. And even when you move to the individual human, we see massive changes in our physiology in space. So metabolic changes, stress response, you get this fluid shift from your legs up into your head. That's causing, not so great for the astronaut, but things like clotting disorders. And we don't have this in space where you have all this movement of fluid up to your head. And so we're seeing really interesting things with intracranial pressure, the spaceflight neuroocular syndrome, which involves the eyes, clotting. We're just uncovering new physiology by putting our bodies in this completely different environment.
There's one thing that we do, we figure things out, we find solutions, and we'll figure out the tools. I mean, looking at your field of expertise and at history, whatever we thought was impossible in the past and which is now we take for granted, what are the elements that you look forward to solve, or, these little boxes that you want to check and say, great, now this is just routine procedure?
Yeah, I think in terms of the medical aspects, We don't have very advanced medical equipment on the space station. It's actually less than you would find in the back of an ambulance. And so I think one of the things we need is improved diagnostic equipment. And I'm very excited about this because I think technology and the scale of microprocessors and the ability to build biomedical devices has really advanced enough to this point that we can start making very small, point of care, rugged medical devices. You design a medical device very differently for space, right? You have this launch cost to get consumables off of Earth. So you probably design it to have very low or no consumable footprint to be able to be reusable. You have to think about power, mass, and volume in a way that if you're designing a piece of equipment for a clinical lab in a hospital, just assume I can plug it into a bench. I just assume there's internet, there's, nicely filtered water available on demand, and then all the supplies you want from a catalog. Space is completely different, so you design your hardware differently. And of course, it's going to be driven to be really small and portable. And so that's the kind of hardware that I would have used when I was doing work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that was one of the driving principles behind establishing this institute. It's called the Institute for Space and Global Biomedicine, because we think some of these advances in space have a really direct impact for human health on Earth. So I'm pretty excited about the diagnostic hardware. I'm also really excited about this idea of reusing every molecule on the space station. So our water loop is 97% closed loop efficient, that's amazing, right? This has taken decades of research and engineering. And it's sort of gross, right? Because you're basically drinking your crewmate's urine. But I've actually tasted it. It tastes fine. No issues there. Drink that for 300 days. That shows us what we can do with engineering in terms of this kind of maximum recycling. So I'm excited to go do that for other molecules, right? We have CO2 is a problem in spacecraft. We generate a lot of CO2 as humans, and that gets toxic for us. So we have really great ways to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere that are regenerable, but we just throw that CO2 overboard. So could we capture that CO2? That's then carbon, which can be a feedstock for bacteria. And then we have this synthetic biology. So the bacteria are making something useful for us. Rubber O-rings, whatever, food, pharmaceuticals, whatever we need on station. Same thing with the urine. We pull all the water out of it, but we leave a lot of nitrogen behind. So could that nitrogen be turned into a fertilizer that feeds plants that grow on space station, that in turn, they give us a little bit of oxygen, they scrub a little bit of CO2, they're tasty to eat, and they supply additional antioxidants. So I think closing these loops, and some of these loops won't close, or they won't make economic sense to close, but as we're researching them, we're going to find all kinds of interesting things that could help us build devices on Earth for that same recycling and sustainability purposes.
I wrote this piece about how there's a revolution in recycling technologies coming up because the incentives of space are very much the opposite of here on Earth. It's actually much cheaper to be not efficient. Just throw the stuff and you can resupply on your way to pretty much anywhere. But in space, these atoms of carbons that have been transformed and are used in certain goals, it would be stupid to just throw that outside into space. You want to figure out how these atoms stay in and are recycled through various purposes, because that is really gold. You can't go and say, I'm on my way to Mars, but I'm going to go and resupply by, the gas station. You have to carry everything that you have with you, and you have to figure out how to recycle it and keep it. So the incentives are very much upside down in space rather than here on Earth.
Absolutely. My favorite line is every molecule counts on the way to Mars.
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting exercise because the inputs and the outputs of the system can be quantified because you have such a closed loop on the space station or in future stations or future spacecraft. You actually can quantify where are your molecules going. We've got sensors for all those kinds of things. And like you said, the economics are very different. So you can actually really do this optimized economic problem of, how much does my hardware cost? How much do the reagents cost? Is the juice worth the squeeze? And then point yourself towards the activities or the molecules or specific processes where you're getting the most out of it for the least amount of input. Now that input could be actual dollars. It could be power, because we're usually pretty power limited. It could be space, but these are all things where we actually have numerical values for it. So it just becomes this kind of very fascinating, complicated logistics problem.
I had a few friends, they had an amazing garden, but they were using their own personal leftovers to enrich the soil. And then I had another friend who, once they learned that, they got totally grossed out on the beautiful fruits that they had. And I was like, it's no different. It's the concept of it that people struggle with, but the biology, the reality of it is nothing different than anything else. So were you always interested into this field of biology and space, or they kind of came together along your journey?
Kind of in separate silos. I always said as a kid I wanted to be an astronaut, a biologist, and a geologist. But then, astronaut's not something you can major in college in, and there's not a lot of people that do it. So it doesn't turn into a very realistic career path. And so I pursued biology and I started studying viruses and infectious disease and, went through grad school, set up my lab at the Whitehead Institute at MIT and was sort of just planning on being a professor for the rest of my life. And my friend called me one day and said, "Hey, there's astronaut applications online. We should apply to be astronauts." She was kidding. I don't always read those social cues. So I applied to be an astronaut, never dreaming that NASA would call me. So when we started our lunar geology training at NASA, it was like, this is the trifecta. It's a hat trick. I've now done it. I can be a fake geologist for a little while. And I really, really enjoyed the lunar geology classes. But they've come together in an interesting way because spaceflight has such a profound effect on biology. And the time that I was flying on the space station was really when we were developing molecular biology tools to do a lot more and expand the research that we were able to do on the space station. So I could bring both of those loves together in one field.
Many of my conversation, I remind people the challenge of that we have as a species. We're the only species on Earth that has to fight its biology. No other creature on Earth has to study the impact of their own behavior. No one is questioning, whether they're pooping too much in the ocean or whether they're eating too much. No other species on Earth worries about the output. We're the first one that has to worry about that. And going to space is going to be challenging doing so. But it's a very interesting place where we're at, looking back into the evolution of our species, our life on Earth, having this single organism that kind of idled for billions of years, and then that leap from single cell to multi-cell created the Cambrian and this explosion and evolution. And now we're about to go from single planet to multi-planet, which the parallel can be said from one molecule to two-cell organism, which will catapult our evolution to an entire new field.
It's interesting to, you talk about we have to manage our waste and those kinds of things. It's because our ability to produce things, outpaces our ability. No other species has the kind of the calories just available, right? To the point where now we have to restrict some kinds of foods because they're really not good for our biology. I think, space is still going to be resource limited for a while, for a long time. There's a lot of efforts to develop commercial markets from space, and it's kind of the pure scientists at the beginning. I sort of hated that. I was like, this is destroying this beautiful scientific thing. But it's actually, I think, something that needs to be done, right? The U.S. invested in the highway system, which really allowed transportation, or think about railroads or any of these sorts of things. If there's a commercial market to support that, number one, if there's a commercial market, you're actually producing something that's useful for people on Earth. And so that's good. I think we've had a lot of years of sending things to space and we get, some return, but it's maybe a little bit opaque to people what that real return on investment is. And so if there's a commercial product they can buy that was enabled by space exploration or they can use, that's going to be really good. And that's also going to allow us to support exploration at a scale that we haven't been able to do. We just are not going to do with 1 or 2 or 5 governments investing. That there has to be enough self-sustainment. You got to get this flywheel going that will allow for really big expansions into space.
How much the AI is going to be part of that?
It's everywhere, right? I think it's going to be very interesting if you think about like the problem that we talked about earlier, the inputs and the outputs. That is a great problem for AI right there. Find an optimized consumable path given all these things, and then build a model where if you tweak different levers of my equipment costs $10,000 a unit versus we've got some engineering advantages. Now it only costs 5,000 a unit. How does that change my whole model there? Like that's a perfect case. But, I think as AI becomes involved in everything we do, things like rocketry design, space station design, managing how we do experiments on board, how we interpret those experiments on board. I think the level of information that we're able to get out of experiments on board is going to go up A cool example of that is Gene Lab that's run by NASA. And so that's a repository for every investigator that has genomic data, whether that's human or cells, whatever you have, they deposit in Gene Lab. And then investigators can go in and actually combine those data sets to make new investigations and to get new levels of insight. And so thinking about setting AI loose on those sorts of patterns, I think we'll be able to get even more out of the data we have. Now, the data that we have has not been generated with AI in mind. It's pretty lossy. We don't have enough metadata. We need, I think, in the future to design our experiments with AI in mind so that current models and future models are going to have enough information about the data that we generate to really build classifiers and to make sense of it.
That was one of the questions that I was going to ask you, how AI will help predict these experiments that are, from a biology standpoint, nature doesn't want perfection. It's evolution and adaptation. There's an element of chaos that will always be present. So you can never have a 100% closed system where all the parameters are checked. So how can you create these models that try to predict procreation, giving birth is going to be successful or not successful? Like, even if you want to create a simulation with that, nature is by default will throw all the cards up in the air and see what works, what doesn't work.
I think you start small. So these organoid models that's a really good example. As we build these out, we're going to get information, all the different omics, right? Genomics, the study of the DNA. Transcriptomics, the study of what they're doing, what RNA transcripts are producing. Proteomics, metabolomics, epigenomes, epitranscriptomes. So you can do about 9 or 10 levels of characterization describing what's happening in these cells. And as you do that, you can compare it to Earth-based controls. So you can see, number one, the changes that microgravity induces, but you can also see how the system itself is responding on all these different levels. You have to conduct the experiments correctly. Again, like, the experiments have to be done right. These have to be really high quality experiments to make use of that data, because garbage in, garbage out. But I think it's going to be incredibly exciting to start to get 10 to the 3, 10 to the 4 more data out of each experiment, given not just AI, but the level of detail that we can get from genomics, transcriptomics. As that field has expanded, we get so much more information out of every single cell than we would have before, where we're just maybe reading out one protein or 10 proteins. Now we can read out all the proteins that cell makes. And so I think the combination of our ability to generate much more biological data and then also to interpret it and build models around it. So you might not be able to answer how humans could procreate or give birth in space, but you could probably start to build a pretty good model of what the liver does in space. What's happening with metabolic dysfunction, what's happening with additional stress. How does that resemble aging? That's one of the coolest things, is that a lot of these changes that we have in astronauts really resemble aging. And so you basically get this opportunity to see aging and chronic diseases, but you don't have to wait 50 years for that experiment to take place. You can induce that very quickly in space. And so I think we'll start with the systems that are simple enough to model, and we're just going to keep working our way up in terms of complexity. And at some point, the data is going to get good enough to build a good enough model that we'll be able to simulate more problems in space. But as you said, simulations take you so far. Nature and space are always going to throw you a curveball. That's why we keep exploring.
It's really going to be interesting. So what are the tools or experiments that we have so far? Have they been experiments on the International Space Station that have been ongoing in terms of either proteins or single cell organisms that have been in space, and we can now understand some of the changes?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've sent the organoids up to space. We can culture those for 30 days. We've sent yeast, we've sent bacteria. We've used synthetic biology to try to produce something with these yeast or bacteria. Almost all of those experiments have really been on the order of about a month at their max, because that's kind of the schedule of the cargo vehicle. So the vehicle sends up your experiment, stays there for 30 days, and then brings the components back down to Earth. So I think a really exciting thing is going to be to look at much longer term changes associated with space. And so that's going to require more of the analysis to be done on the space station. That gets back to this point of care idea. You're going to have to build equipment that can satisfy the constraints of space. But the more we can start analyzing on the space station, then we're not waiting to send the materials back. So you could start to process a lot more samples. I think the other thing that's going to speed this up is automation. So right now it's very manual. I grew some cardiomyocytes as an organ to simulate heart tissue on board. And you've got to change the media. You got to take away the waste and give them more food to grow every few days. And I had to do that with 2 syringes, pulling and pushing 10 mils of media. And it would take me 15 minutes for a group of 4 organoids. So obviously you're not going to scale very quickly with that. If we have something like an automated cell culture machine, which is not that difficult to envision with current technology, and there are such things on Earth right now, you could keep this experiment going. You could even automatically sample off of it, right, with very little human intervention. So you could imagine now you can scale this. You can do many more organ systems. You can take many more time points. So I think both the automation as well as the movement of our devices that are doing all the analysis up to space will help us really scale what we're going to do.
So there hasn't been any experiment that have just been ongoing, like a leftover sourdough starter, which just remains in the space station and then will become whatever it will become. Everything has been taken out every 30 something plus days.
Yeah. And it's really one of the most interesting things. So in yeast biology, there's something called a chemostat, which is a very old piece of scientific hardware. You basically just grow yeast. You keep feeding them inputs. You take things out. You can change the limiting conditions in that pool of yeast and see how they respond genomically. Like, wouldn't it be super cool to have a chemostat of yeast in space and to have these really long generation experiments? The one that's come closest that I can think of is experiment with C. elegans. So these very small worms. Some of them were mutated to have dystrophin mutation, which is the gene that's involved in muscular dystrophy. And they were wondering, how does that change when you put it into this microgravity environment? I think we're still waiting for that paper to come out, but they did 7 generations of this nematode. And so that's pretty cool when you start to think about it. Now you can look at, hey, are we actually evolving something in space? And so to do that really quickly, you might want to use something like E. coli or yeast. The doubling time's 24 hours. You can get a new generation every day. And then to really look at that long term, how do these organisms, which are uniquely evolved for fitness in their given environment, how do they change themselves when you put them in a new environment? It's a long way to extrapolate that to humans. So at the same time, you also want to be studying that human physiology. And we're not going to get those generational experiments. But I think if you approach it from the bottoms up and the top down, we're going to come across some really interesting discoveries.
So what were the limitations or the rationale behind not having these multi-year experiments where we could see the impact of long-term on organisms?
I think a lot of it comes down to logistics. So to do that really long-term experiment, you would have to, with methods before automation, you'd have to devote a lot of crew time. It would be very expensive in terms of the number of hours that astronauts would have to spend on these experiments. And your number of crew hours it's a finite pool. And so if you're doing that, you're taking away from other investigators and new and different types of experiments. And so I think NASA's really chosen to get the most number of different individual investigators and different kinds of science up to the space station. I think as you start to develop automation, and maybe this will carry forward into some of the commercial space stations, you free up that constraint of crew time. You still have a constraint of consumables. You're still going to have to continuously supply the media and the glucose that keeps these organisms alive, and you're going to continuously generate waste. But you can do some smart things with that. Like you could send up powdered media if you really worked on sterilization, and you could use some of the space station water so that you're not shipping up liquid. I think there's ways to optimize on all of that. And so I think as we move into building new capabilities in low Earth orbit, and particularly on these commercial space stations, that's going to enable these really long-term, long-duration experiments.
Do you think that the future of our journey into space is going to be more space station than settling on planet? Like by the time we get to Mars, perhaps the technology will be better to create something in where we control more of the elements rather than trying to adapt ourselves into a planet that has a different gravity and different environment.
Yeah, I think it's going to be both scenario, right? You have a lot of technology development to get you even to sustained lunar. The technology development that's a pretty high bar for a sustained lunar colony, and then also getting to Mars. But in the meantime, if the commercial side of things takes off and we start to develop a low Earth orbit economy, it's not just commercial, right? Some of the ways that these commercial space stations are supporting themselves is by supporting science, and governments will pay to continue to have their research done aboard that. So it's not just serving commercial interests. So we're going to continue to expand the base of our scientific knowledge as the number of space stations in low Earth orbit goes up. That will expand as the amount of automation goes up, and then the amount of parameters that we can detect. You could really see an explosion of research in low Earth orbit that's both helping human health on the planet, but is also enabling these long duration voyages to the moon or Mars.
People tend to forget about previous big immigrations or these moments, or even from Europe to North America. Everything was resource driven. Nature works in these incentives that unfortunately creates a point of tension in where species will be driven to go and push the boundaries, to go behind the mountain.
That idea of like curiosity is a human element that we can layer on top of those evolutionary drives. And I think curiosity and scientific exploration and building new things and making new things is what's going to sustain that drive, at least initially. Space is just a really harsh mistress. There's not a lot of resources out there. And so we're going to start to develop these things. It's called in situ resource utilization. We're going to start to figure out how to make bricks out of lunar regolith and how to get water and how to recycle things. I think there's not going to be enough resources in space to really sustain us until we do a lot of that technological development. But that's really exciting about what's happening right now. We're doing some of this. We're testing future environmental control and life support systems for Mars on the International Space Station. We're going to test in situ resource utilization on the moon before we go to Mars. And all that technology development at some point may generate enough resources for us to be self-sustaining in space. I always caution people, there's science fiction and then there's the length of time it takes to get you to science fiction. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, you give us 1 million years, we're going to have warp drives and all these crazy things, like up to the limit of physics. But it was going to take us a very long time to get there.
Talking about science fiction, are you good at separating the scientific mind and the entertaining side of movies where you look at it, it's like, no, that would not. Oh, I find it always really hard. Like even more now you get to learn about the biology. You see movies where species are going from one planet to the other without any concern of the difference of gravity or difference of environments or all these differences. I have to put my mind to rest so not to think about it. Is it the same thing for you?
Yeah, I think you can definitely tell in Hollywood who's hired a good scientific consultant and who hasn't. And so, the ones with good science in them, like The Martian, that was a pretty good scientific movie. I'm not a physicist, but my impression is Interstellar did a pretty good job with some of the physics. Those ones are very enjoyable to watch because it's scientifically plausible and it's cool, futuristic sci-fi. I read a lot of sci-fi books. For those ones, you just put it into this bucket of far future. I don't worry about how practical these technologies are when the books are talking about multi-planet, multi-galaxy civilizations. I think it's the movies that are in our near future. Then you could actually imagine a scientific path. And I really like it when people get that right, or at least they get down the right path. And it goes both directions too. I mean, what we do technology-wise, what we develop is profoundly influenced by science fiction. It's sort of a place where we can put all of our creative ideas about the technology or the way we would want society to look in the future, or maybe if you're in the dystopian genre, what we don't want it to look like. But that inspires us to build things and design things that would take us along that path, which I think is really cool. I think there's a lot to learn from science fiction in terms of what are the next things we should build in space.
I've always wondered in Star Wars, where were the toilets on the spaceship? They go at speed of light between worlds in these little spaceships. Like we travel to Australia and we struggle just on the flights for 8 hours. And here you are into this spaceship traveling at the speed of light between universe. There has to be a place to go, or there has to be ways to move.
Dune solves that, right? You have a Fremen still suit that's recycling your waste. So, the writers of this are not always giving us a practical manual how to explore space, but they are provoking interesting thought exercises and I think some paths to developing hardware, some ways that we would think about hardware development.
In terms of timeline, I mean, it's always really hard to predict, but if you say like where you think we might be in 50 years from now, where would you like to be?
I think in 50 years, it's realistic to have a permanent lunar colony and to be exploration on Mars. I don't think we'll have a permanent Mars colony by then. But again, a lot of it depends on some unknown unknowns about, do we make some technological leaps, right? Do we get small nuclear power? on a spacecraft. And NASA's kind of done a few turns around that and is now refocusing on that. I think that's really important for getting us to Mars, because all these risks that we're talking about for the human body multiply with the length of the voyage. And so if you can get there quicker, that's the easiest way to bring the risk down. You're just exposed to less radiation because you're getting there much quicker. Same thing for the risks of our environmental life support. What if that toilet on your spacecraft breaks down halfway to Mars? That's not a good situation for anybody. So I think the technology development and sort of when we can make some big advances in probably propulsion, radiation shielding, and life support are the areas where we need some big advances to make permanent colonies or really regular voyages to Mars a reality. I think that's very doable with the technology we have in 50 years. And, now there's this unknown factor of like you apply AI to it. And I mean, time is just sped up. Like what's happened in that world in the last week or the last month, as we start applying this to spaceflight, you could see some pretty big leaps.
In terms of physics, we've reached the limits that we have, and everyone that I talk to, they all say the same thing. We have to discover new physics that doesn't exist right now to solve these issues. In terms of biology, are we at a very different place in where it's not about discovering new biology, but just understanding the extent of how our biology or biology in general works because we know so little about it?
I think it's a little bit more the latter. By studying biology in space, we're going to really learn. First of all, I don't think we've even mapped all the weird things that are happening to the human body, right? Like this clotting thing came up in the last 10 years. I don't think we've studied the brain enough in space. The clotting came about because, again, you have this fluid shift upwards and you have stagnant or even reverse jugular blood flow, which allows clots to form. We really haven't studied the brain. And so you have good lymphatic flushing. We know that we're already accumulating intracranial pressure. I think it'd be very interesting to study the space brain sort of as a model of potential dysfunction. I'm sure my fellow astronauts are going to love that one. I'm going to tell them, you guys, your brains are dysfunctional. We need to study it. But I do think there's an impact if you look at CSF, lymphatics, all that kind of thing. So I think we're still going to be in this area of uncovering new areas of physiology that we then need to develop countermeasures for. I think the countermeasure development, that will start to be accelerated. The more opportunity that we have to do experiments in space, the more likely we are to be able to develop a countermeasure. And the countermeasure can be something like a pharmaceutical. It can be a different way of doing shielding. And so that's in the realm of, I don't think we have some advance in new physics, right? We don't have to get unobtainium to do countermeasures for some of these things that we see. It's still a risk to the human body. And so if we really want to lower that risk, maybe that's where a big advancement would allow somebody to spend their entire life on Mars. Right now, that 2.5-year voyage out and back, like really don't want that radiation dose. You're going to top out on your radiation limit. So we have to probably develop some more countermeasures for radiation. But it's doable to do one trip to Mars, just not really right now to spend your whole life there.
Is radiation, I mean, hypothetically, I have no idea of what it entails, but is there a day where you could think there's a vaccine for radiation?
I wouldn't specify the form that it comes in, but some sort of radioprotective. There could be, people are actively researching pharmaceuticals that can be radioprotective. It could be things like figuring out how to lower the inflammation state in the human. Could also help with radiation. There's wild things like, this is totally up Chris Mason's alley, but talking about tardigrades, which are very radiation resistant. They're the little microscopic, adorable little water bears. So he talks about splicing tardigrade DNA into human DNA. I think, ethically, we're a little bit far from that. We have to figure that out in other model organisms. But there's a lot of things that are out there that could potentially solve this problem. It's going to require a lot of research to understand that. But this isn't research that's just helpful for space, right? This is helpful for Earth radiation issues as well, protecting radiation workers, and just understanding how our body responds to the accumulation of insults and injuries. And that's really what aging is, right? Our cells keep getting oxidative stress. They keep getting all these insults, and at some point they break down. And so I think the work that we're doing in radiation biology can help us also understand all these things for aging. And so there could be some synergy there between what we're discovering to help humans with radiation in space and what we can identify for health span, aging, and chronic diseases.
I wrote this piece about how we will live longer just because the scale of the universe demands it. Being 100 years old on this planet is okay. I don't think that there's need to live longer. But if we start to venture into space, just because of the scale of it, we will have to live longer, where traveling for a couple of years doesn't seem as long as traveling for a few hours at the same distance used to take months here on Earth. So
yeah, I think it's not just technology, right? Like, would you actually want to be alive for 100,000 years? I mean, there's a lot of content on Netflix, but you'd finish that pretty quickly, right? So, then you get into things like suspended animation. You're putting yourself in stasis and then waking up. All the cool thoughts that people have in that sci-fi realm, plus technology development to get you there faster. And again, I'm not a physicist, but if we're really going to go anywhere reasonable, faster than light travel, I think is going to be important.
if we look back into what we thought was impossible and now is just a question of getting into a plane and traveling halfway across the world, where just 100 years ago took months, we have to look into the future with that same perspective.
Absolutely.
Dr. Rubin, what would be your 3 words of wisdom?
My 3 words of wisdom. I think never stop exploring. It's obviously very applicable to spaceflight, but in people's lives, humans are so driven by curiosity, and curiosity and finding things out usually gives us a lot of joy. I don't have a lot of joy in my day job right now of answering emails and writing grants and buying equipment for my new institute. But the idea of these future science experiments that we can do, things that we can learn, tools that we can develop that will help human health on Earth, that possibility of finding things out, that's driven by curiosity, and that's pretty exciting. And so I think finding curiosity in your life, finding delight. If you ever watch a 2-year-old going on a walk just down the sidewalk, and the joy of like picking up a rock and examining a new plant and those kinds of things, that brings a lot to life. And so that sense of curiosity, people can find that amongst their email inbox, make room for that in their lives. That's an important thing, and it's very good for all of us to experience that.
Exploration is curiosity activated. Curiosity by itself does not get you anywhere. It needs to be acted on. And that's what exploration is. And exploration is just not physical or geographical, going, on top of the mountain, but it's purposely going with the intent of learning and discovering the unknown. So it can be personal discovery. It can be, science, arts, anything.
Absolutely.
Dr. Rubin, it's been a real pleasure. Good luck with the Institute. There's amazing work that you guys are doing. And with our good friend Mason, I think the next 50 years are going to bring tremendous new discoveries in biomedicine and biology. So it's going to be exciting.
We're pretty excited about the future too.
Excellent. Looking forward. Thank you, Dr. Rubin.
Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.